Hi everybody, I am Celeste Amat, a researcher in computer science and privacy, and today I am presenting with Christiana Santos, a legal scholar, this interdisciplinary work we did with Natalia Bielova, also a computer scientist. This work is about purposes in IAB Europe's Transparency and Consent Framework.
So let's start with an introduction on the TCF. The Transparency and Consent Framework was introduced by IAB Europe to standardize the collection of consent in reaction to the GDPR, just 1 month before its application in April 2018. A second version was released this year in August, so 2 months ago. Previous studies showed that version 1 was used on at least 6.5% of top European websites. Also, Google starts using the frameworks starting from version 2. This framework introduces new actors called CMPs, responsible for the collection of consent through cookie banners. These actors are central to the tracking ecosystem, as they are the interface between publishers, advertisers, and us end users that click on the accept button of banners. The CMPs display the so-called cookie banners to the end users so as to collect their consent for data collection and tracking. As required by the GDPR, these cookie banners propose users to customize their consent depending on purposes of data collection. So as an example, we show you a cookie banner by OneTrust. You can see the different purposes squared in red, and for each of them, users can toggle a slider that you can see on the right. So these purposes that are shown on cookie banners are standardized in the TCF. There are 5 purposes in version 1 and 12 of them in version 2. We focus our work on these purposes. Our main questions relate to the legality and use of these purposes. Are they specific and explicit? What is the legal basis? How many advertisers use the different purposes, and under which legal basis do they claim to operate? Consent or legitimate interest?
How to define purposes? The GDPR and the 29 Working Party, now EDPB endorsed, define the principle of purpose specification. This principle sets the legal requirements to define purposes to process personal data. And they are 3: specific, explicit, and legitimate. Specific means that purposes need to be precise and clear, with enough detail to check what kind of processing is or is not included in the purpose. So, of course, purposes that are too vague or general are not allowed. For example, improving users' experience, marketing purposes, future research are not specific enough to be used. Explicit means that purposes need to be expressed, not hidden, and ambiguous. Any purpose that leaves doubt, confusion, or difficulty in understanding are not explicit. Legitimate means that purposes need to conform to a legal basis for processing. And regarding the use of cookies and similar technologies, the legal basis is consent. These requirements contribute to transparency, legal certainty, and aims to protect data subjects by setting limits on how controllers are able to use the data, the personal data of users. Are IAB purposes specific and explicit? Let's have a look into 2 examples. Purpose 10 of version 2, develop and improve products. This purpose is not specific, actually it is vague, not detailed enough to determine the type of processing going on, and therefore is not possible to derive the legal basis. This kind of purpose facilitates hypothetical processing of personal data. As for purpose 3 of version 1, it is called ad selection, delivery, and reporting. This purpose is not explicit. Actually, it is a combination between advertising and profiling, even if from the title of this purpose is not even possible to derive the profiling part. Which is the legal basis of purposes of IAB Europe? Are they legitimate? This table shows the purposes of version 2, the legal basis that the TCF defined as allowable, and what is our interpretation on the legal basis. Let's select purpose 3, create a personalized ads profile. For this purpose, the TCF uses both consent and legitimate interest, though we claim that only explicit consent is correct. Actually, when targeted ads based on profiling may have significant effects on consumers, explicit consent is required. This happens, for example, when profiling and tracking of individuals happens across different websites, devices, and services, and this is what the IAB TCF framework permits.
Now that we discussed the legal aspects, we'll show you statistics about purposes declared by advertisers. Since all information regarding the declaration of purposes by advertisers is public, we can make statistics about them. First of all, we computed this graph on purposes used in the version 1 of the TCF. Each one of the 600 vendors is represented by a vertical band showing the number of defined purposes along with the declared legal basis, with legitimate interest in red and consent in blue. So basically, the red area represents the use of legitimate interest, while the blue area represents the usage of consent. From this graph, we can extract the following information. 46% of advertisers operate on legitimate interest for at least one purpose. So this corresponds to the vertical bands that contain at least some red. Secondly, 90% of advertisers operate on legitimate interest for all purposes. So this time these are the vertical bands that are fully red. Okay? Now, this graph was computed for the paper in January of this year, but the version 2 of the TCF was released since that date, and the version 1 is now obsolete. So, for this presentation, we recomputed this graph on version 2 with recent number, and that's what you see on the left. So, you can see that the red area is now smaller compared to the blue area, but this is due to the fact that the version 2 introduces a mechanism called flexible purposes, which basically allows advertisers to delegate the decision of the legal basis to the publishers. So, in other words, an advertiser can say, I'm using consent for purpose number, for example, 2, but publishers can decide to use legitimate interest anyway. We show on the graph on the right that use of this mechanism is widespread, as 46% of advertisers use this mechanism for at least one purpose. We can also focus on statistics for each individual purpose. We show the 5 purposes of version 1 on the left and the 12 purposes of version 2 on the right. Once again, we show updated numbers for version 2, but the number of the paper from January for version 1, since that version is not in use anymore. We can make a handful of observations. First of all, in both versions, more advertisers rely on consent for purpose 1 than for other purposes. Secondly, in version 1, 129 advertisers rely on legitimate interest for purpose 1, and the same is true for almost 200 advertisers for purpose 5, even though we saw earlier that they require consent. Then lastly, we can make similar observations on version 2 with recent numbers. For the purpose number 3 mentioned earlier, 42 advertisers use legitimate interest and 134 use flexible purposes. Sadly, it's already the conclusion of this presentation. So, to sum up, we analyze the purposes defined in IAB Europe's TCF versions 1 and 2 and what purposes advertisers declare to use. To give a few key results, we found that in version 1, 2 purposes are not explicit and 3 are not specific. In version 2, 4 are not specific. More broadly, we find that the vast majority of purposes require consent. We also made some statistics, finding for instance that almost 200 advertisers use the purpose measurement under legitimate interest, even though it requires consent. We hope that the study brings transparency to the use of purposes by advertisers. Our work demonstrates the persistence of the advertising industry in non-compliant methods for tracking and profiling with regard to the GDPR and the e-privacy directive, bundled in often complex and vague presentations of purposes. The CNIL has already pronounced that the TCF defined its purposes in a vague and imprecise way in the decision against the Vectory company in 2018. The Belgian DPA has conducted an investigation in the TCF and produced a document a few days ago pointing at serious GDPR infringements in the framework. We encourage you to have a look at the full paper to read a full analysis and obtain more statistics, and enjoy the reading!
Thank you for your attention. We're looking forward to your questions in the Q&A.